Hey guys, it's me, Aunt Shelley, and welcome back for book number 10, Happy Haunting Amelia Badellia by Herman Parrish, pictures by Lynn Sweat. So I love Amelia Badellia books, and I hope you do too. This one is a little bit long, so we'll just get right to it, okay? So here we go. When Amelia Badellia arrived for work, she could not believe her eyes. "Oh my gosh," said Amelia Badellia. "What happened to the house?" "This is terrible," said Amelia Badellia. "Mr. and Mrs. Rogers must need me. Someone's ruined their house." She ran for the front door. So there it is. There's a bunch that says, "Boo to you, scram. It's dark in here. I'll be right back. Good riddance. I said I was sick." So there's Amelia Badellia running for the house. "Ah!" yelled Amelia Badellia. "Help!" Mr. and Mrs. Rogers rushed outside. "Hold still," said Mrs. Rogers. "I'll get the bats out of your belfry." "Ha!" said Mr. Rogers. "That would be a full-time job. She's made me bats for years." "You're untangled, Amelia Badellia," said Mrs. Rogers. "Come inside and relax." So a belfry, I think, is her, like, bonnet hat. So she was all tangled. And Mr. Rogers was saying that Mrs. Rogers had made him bats, which means kind of crazy, for years. "Wow," said Amelia Badellia. "Who wrecked your house?" "We did," said Mrs. Rogers. "We're getting ready for Halloween." "Is that tonight?" said Amelia Badellia. "How did you forget?" said Mr. Rogers. "Those bats on the front porch must have made you batty." So there's their house looking all spooktacular for Halloween. "Sorry," said Amelia Badellia. "I've been very busy. I was at school helping children make costumes." "Good for you," said Mrs. Rogers. "We invited all of our neighbors for the Halloween party, and you too. Tonight, the best costume wins a prize." "Gosh," said Amelia Badellia, "your house looks so spooky." "Thanks," said Mrs. Rogers. "The spookier the better. That's the idea," said Mr. Rogers. "What fun," said Amelia Badellia. "I'll need your help to clean up." "No, you won't," said Mr. Rogers. "I worked hard to make this place look shabby." So they wanted it to look bad. "Then I'll help you mess it up," said Amelia Badellia. "What should I do first?" "Hand me that hammer," said Mr. Rogers. "But first, crack a window. It's gotten warm in here." "Key-rash!" "Uh-oh," said Amelia Badellia. "I just tried to crack it, but I broke it." "Amelia Badellia," said Mr. Rogers, "I meant open the window a bit." "It is open," said Amelia Badellia. "There's tons of bits and pieces." So he meant just open it a tiny bit, and she thought she was supposed to crack it with a hammer. "Oh, it's not your fault, dear," said Mrs. Rogers. "Besides, that broken window makes our house look truly haunted." Mr. Rogers shook his head and said, "I think you've both gone batty." There's what the wife, Mrs. Rogers, thinks. And Amelia Badellia's cleaning. "What's next?" asked Amelia Badellia. "Let me see," said Mrs. Rogers. "A lot of people are coming tonight. We should add a leaf to the table." "A leaf?" said Amelia Badellia. "Yes, of course," said Mrs. Rogers. "A leaf or two makes the table larger. Do you know where to find the leaves?" "Of course I do," said Amelia Badellia. "Before you go," said Mr. Rogers, "can you hand me that witch?" "That witch what?" said Amelia Badellia. No, not what, said Mr. Rogers. Which? Which what? Said Amelia Badellia. Not which what, Mr. Rogers said. That witch there, with the pointy hat. So she was thinking of the different kind of witch, huh? Amelia Badellia held up two witches. They both have pointy hats, she said. Which witch do you want? Whichever, said Mr. Rogers. No, I mean, whichever witch. Or, you know what? Just skip it. Go get the leaves. Amelia Badellia skipped away. I think she's confused and confusing everybody, huh? Good thing it's fall, said Amelia Badellia. I can get a lot of leaves for the table. She saw something wiggle under the leaf. Sorry, Mr. Worm, but back you go, she said. Yoo-hoo, called Mrs. Rogers from the kitchen window. There's no time for yard work. I need your help. Amelia Badellia went inside. There we go, she said. Now that table looks smaller to me, but it's much prettier. Mrs. Rogers always has great ideas. Amelia Badellia went into the kitchen. Do you think that's what she meant by adding a leaf to the table? Let's keep reading and see. There you are, said Mrs. Rogers. You're so creative with food. Let's cook up some gruesome goodies. Goody, said Amelia Badellia. This worm casserole needs more spaghetti. Cranberry juice makes a tasty vampire punch. Crumble up cookies for the kitty litter cake. We need more eyeballs. I'll peel another bunch of grapes. Dried apricots make delicious ears. There was a knock on the kitchen door. Trick or treat, said Cousin Alcolu. I don't know any tricks, said Amelia Badellia, but you could sample some treats. Thank you, said Cousin Alcolu. I'll call him Al. Mr. Rogers walked into the kitchen. Something smells good, he said. Well, it sure isn't me, said Cousin Al. I've been working very hard. I harvested a load of pumpkins for the party tonight. How generous, said Mr. Rogers. Do you know how to carve jack-o'-lanterns? I did one, said Cousin Al. He showed them his pumpkin. That face looks very familiar, said Amelia Badellia. What does the pumpkin face look like to you guys? Mrs. Rogers tried not to laugh. Very funny, said Mr. Rogers. But that pumpkin's too handsome. Have you got anything scarier? Wait here, said Cousin Al. He went to his truck. Sorry, I got a phone call, and so it shut it off. So there might be a little blip right there. But we're back again. Cousin Al returned with the scariest scarecrow ever. Meet Oswald, said Cousin Al. He scares away the birds for miles. Ooh, said Mrs. Rogers. He sends shivers down my spine. Oswald can sit here for tonight. He doesn't scare me, said Mr. Rogers. I do not know the meaning of the word fear. You don't, said Amelia Badellia. The word fear is in the dictionary. I'll look it up for you. Show me later, said Mr. Rogers. I must get my costume ready. I'm going to be a circus strongman. And I'm going to be a queen, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Badellia, what is your costume going to be? Oops, sorry. There he is, the scarecrow, the circus strongman, and the queen. Gee, said Amelia Badellia, I don't have a costume. Sure you do, said Mr. Rogers. You wear a costume every day. Mrs. Rogers glared at her husband. What do you mean, said Amelia Badellia. These are my clothes, not a costume. I've always dressed like this. Mr. Rogers felt bad about what he said. He was embarrassed to say anything. Come along, Amelia Badellia, said Mrs. Rogers. I have an idea for you. And for Cousin Al. See you tonight, said Mr. Rogers. Amelia Badellia did not reply. That wasn't a very nice comment of Mr. Rogers, was it? That night, as darkness fell, the house really did look haunted. Spooky music with scary sounds. Floorboards creaked, creak. Chains rattled. Moans and groans, woo, filled the air. The doorbell rang. Ding dong. Our first trick-or-treaters, said Mrs. Rogers. Would you get the front door, dear? Yes, Your Majesty, said Mrs. Rogers. As soon as he was out of sight, Mrs. Rogers ran to the back door. While Mr. Rogers handed out treats at the front door, Mrs. Rogers let in a little trick at the back door. Wonder what it will be. Right this way, said Mr. Rogers. Thank you, said a skeleton. I was dying to come in. The party food was a big hit. Care for an eyeball? Said a girl to her dad. Yuck, he said. Yum, said the girl. They're good and disgusting. Try some finger food, said Mr. Rogers. Oh, cool, said a boy. These cookies have little fingers. They were Amelia Badelia's idea, said Mr. Rogers. Where is she? Said the boy. That's a good question, said Mr. Rogers. My stomach just made a growling noise. I just snorted. Sorry. May I have 2 cups of blood? Asked a girl. My pleasure, said Mrs. Rogers. I love your costume. Amelia Badellia helped us, said the boy. Wonderful, said Mrs. Rogers. Maybe you'll win a prize. Have you seen Amelia Badellia? Asked Mr. Rogers. Not yet, said Mrs. Rogers. She might not come, thanks to you. What did I do wrong? Asked Mr. Rogers. You know, said Mrs. Rogers. You made fun of her clothes. I feel terrible, said Mr. Rogers. I'll apologize when I see her. Just then, Mr. Rogers shuddered. What's wrong? Asked Mrs. Rogers. It sounds silly, said Mr. Rogers. That scarecrow gives me the creeps. Scaredy cat, said Mrs. Rogers. It looks alive. I feel like it's watching me. Ding dong! Mr. Rogers jumped. Relax, said Mrs. Rogers. You're imagining things. Go see who's at the door. I wonder if there's something about that scarecrow. It might be the trick that Mrs. Rogers let in the back door. What do you guys think? Mr. Rogers opened the door. He smiled a big smile. Well, well, he said. I've never been so glad to see a ghost. Do come in, Amelia. I mean, Miss Ghost. Woo, said the ghost as she floated in the house. Mr. Rogers, was a perfect host. Care for refreshments, he asked. The ghost shook its head no. Well, said Mr. Rogers, would you like to judge our costume contest? The ghost nodded yes. Attention, everyone, said Mrs. Rogers. It's time for our Halloween costume contest. Anyone who wishes to compete for a prize, step up this way. I'm Sunny Day, your TV weatherman. I forecast I will win. You can't beat peace and love. This hippie has the grooviest t-shirt and bell bottoms. So she has tea bags and bells on her pants. If I win, I will still be in a pickle. I'm all eyes. I'm all ears, and I'm right under your nose. All eyes, all ears, right under their nose. Bravo, said Mrs. Rogers. Yes, said Mr. Rogers. I can tell that Amelia Badellia helped them a lot. Too bad she couldn't be here tonight. He winked at Mrs. Rogers. Just then, the clock struck 10. Okay, everyone, said Mrs. Rogers. Time to take off your masks. Oh my gosh, I just burped again, you guys. I'm so sorry. Came out of nowhere. Uh-oh, said the ghost. It tried to slip away. Whoa there, said Mr. Rogers. It's time I put my foot down. Mr. Rogers stepped on the sheet as the ghost kept walking. The sheet was pulled off to reveal... Who do you think it is? Cousin Al, said Mr. Rogers. Where is Amelia Badellia? Cousin Al looked very afraid. He pointed behind Mr. Rogers. He opened his mouth to speak, but he was scared speechless. Mr. Rogers wheeled around. Boo! Screamed the Scarecrow. Yay! Yelled Mr. Rogers. He threw his barbell up in the air. Mr. Rogers turned around and ran into Cousin Al. They both fell into a heap. Happy Halloween, said Amelia Badellia. Amelia Badellia? Said Mr. Rogers. Said Cousin Al. I think you should call her Amelia Hold on, let me try again. I think you should call her Amelia Badellia. Cousin Al has quite a sense of humor, huh? As your queen, said Mrs. Rogers, I declare Amelia Badellia the winner of the best costume. I keep hitting this, so if it makes a banging noise, you guys, I'm really sorry. The next day, Amelia Badellia and Cousin Al came to help clean up. Great party, said Cousin Al. Thank you, said Mrs. Rogers. We'll do it again next year. Start planning your costume now. I will, said Amelia Badellia, but you have the best costume ideas. Those trick-or-treaters, said Mr. Rogers. Somebody piled leaves on our table. That was me, said Amelia Badellia. That was lovely, said Mrs. Rogers. They made a beautiful centerpiece. Mrs. Rogers showed Amelia Badellia how to add a leaf to the table. There we go, said Mrs. Rogers. Now let's set the table for lunch. So a leaf is like a little addition to the table. So you pull these two sides out, and then the leaf, which is an extension or an extra piece, goes right there to make the table bigger. But not all tables have that, some do. Amelia Badellia, said Mr. Rogers, I apologize for what I said yesterday. Apology accepted, said Amelia Badellia. Try some leftover worm casserole. Mr. Rogers took a huge portion. It's very tasty, he said. Glad you like it, said Amelia Badellia. I got worried yesterday when I ran out of spaghetti. You ran out? Said Mr. Rogers. He looked closer at his food. Then, what is it? Said Mr. Rogers. Lucky me, said Amelia Badellia. Every leaf I picked up in your yard had a fat, juicy worm under it. Mr. Rogers turned green as a ghost. Nope, as a witch, sorry. Green as a witch. Trick or treat, said Amelia Badellia, laughing. She's not going to let Mr. Rogers live it down, is she? So that's it. Will Amelia Badellia No, will Halloween drive Amelia Badellia batty? Is what the catchline is. So that, my loves, is all for today. I hope you enjoyed. Happy haunting, Amelia Badellia. I hope to see you again for our next book. I love you all very much and enjoy. All right, I love you. I'll see you soon. Bye.